Hello everyone. Welcome to Property Experts, where we provide you information related to property in a sensible manner. Hence, before purchasing property worth lakhs and crores of rupees, please do watch our videos to prevent yourself from falling under any sort of a scam or a fraud. So friends, in this video, we are going to discuss a very simple yet very important topic. What is the difference between a lease and a rent? For example, should we sign a lease agreement or a rent agreement on the house we want to take on rent? If you want to rent a car in our business, so we will call it on lease or we will call it on rent. So many times this kind of confusion takes place. In this video, we will try to clear this confusion. What is the difference? And what are the advantages and disadvantages? Where you should use lease and where you should use rent. So, keep watching this video. First of all, let us understand the difference between a lease and a rent. What is the main difference between them? See, lease is always used for the long term. If you want to rent any assets which you are taking for say 12 months, so you will use the lease term. The lease agreement signed, or we can also call it to lease deed. For example, if you take an office building for your business on rent, then you sign a long term lease for 3 years, for 4 years, for 5 years, or for 10 years. There can be a 15-year lease agreement. Similarly to the airline industry, leases are used a lot in the airline industry. Aeroplanes are taken on lease for 9 years and 10 years. Similarly, in the office where a lot of manufacturing work is done, equipment is rented there. Sometimes construction companies take equipment for a long-term leases. So, these are some examples where the lease is signed. Assets are taken on lease for long term. Now, on the other hand, if we talk about rent, so if you rent any assets for less than 12 months, we call it renting. For example, like you hire cab of Ola or Uber, so that you hire for a few minutes or a few hours or even a day. Or there are some apps like Zoom Car where you can hire a car for 1 to 4 days. If you are also hiring a car for your office for 1 week or month, so we will call it as renting. Similarly, if I take an example of construction business, if you have hired a crane, let's say for a day or for 15 days, so you will call it renting. Or you can also do a house agreement. So you must have seen it is an 11-month agreement. This is also called a rent agreement. So usually a lease is always signed for a long term. And when you rent something for a short period, it's called renting. But yes, these terms sometimes are used interchangeably. You can also hear a 6 months lease at times, and you may also get to hear a 2-year rent agreement. If you see on a broad level, so the lease is always signed for long term, usually for 12 months or more than that, and rent agreement is always signed for less than 12 months. Now let's try to understand them in more details. And because the lease is signed for long term, so usually the lease who is taking the asset for rent, he is also responsible for the maintenance. Whereas if you rent, like if you took a car on rent, if you have taken an Ola or an Uber, if you take the example of these, so the maintenance is done by the owner. So we can say that the lease is responsible for the maintenance in the lease. That is the one who is renting it. And in renting, it is the responsibility of the owner for the maintenance. Now let us understand the negative and positive points of both. See, because you are signing the lease for the long term, that means you have locked its price. If you have taken an office building or a house for rent, so you locked its rent for a long term. So are sure that the rent will not increase all of a sudden. But in the case of renting, the rate can also increase every month. Suppose if we talk about the prices of Ola and Uber, so even daily the prices fluctuate. And similarly, if you take a car for 1 month, so your rent for 1 month has come. But if you take it in the next month, then it may change. Even if the rents increase in the house, so the landlord says that either you vacate my house or else increases the rent. So there is more flexibility in terms of renting, but in the case of the lease, we can say that the surety is high and the security is high. For lease, and the second thing you have to take care of, that the agreement in renting can get terminated very soon. The argument can also be terminated and the agreement can be also terminated. So if we talked about these are agreements, using a 1 month clause is given so that the agreement can break by the landlord and tenant by giving 1 month notice. But this does not happen in the case of lease, because in the middle of the lease, let's say if the lease is for 10 years, so if the tenant or landlord breaks it in the middle, so the penalties are maintained quite high. There could be a penalty of 6 months rent, there could be a penalty of 1 year. Apart from these, the clause is very inserted in the lease that the lease is one who is renting it. He can also become an owner in the future if he makes the payment of the value of the asset at that time, which is also called as hire purchase system. But this is not possible in the case of renting. In the case of renting, the owner is always the owner. Tenant can't become owner right away. Even in the rent agreement, no such clause is written. So this is some difference you should keep in mind. If you are renting any assets, whether you should take a lease or take a rent, if your requirement is short term, then you can rent. Maybe its rent is a bit high if you are taking it on rest for the short term. But if you don't have its use after some time, so there is no use in taking it for a long time. On the other hand, if you use an asset for a long term but you don't want to buy it, so lease can be a very good option for you. There is security for lessor and lease that the asset has been booked for such a period, and it becomes advantageous for the tenant as well. If you say for lease, so the price gets locked for him. So if you rent an asset in the future, keep all these things in mind. Thank you so much for watching. Do watch all our videos so that every doubt of yours is cleared regarding property. Thank you so much.